Prince Humping Bear grew up next to a gas station 9 miles outside of New Orleans, so he used to tell everyone that he was from New Orleans even though he wasn't. Every time he slept with a girl, he'd tell her that other girls liked to call him Hurricane in bed, even though no woman had ever actually called him that. His mother was only 20 years old when she got pregnant with the prince during a one-night stand. She had just recently been divorced from her high school sweetheart, who had taken to calling her the Queen of the Whores after the split. She liked the idea of being a queen, though, and decided that she would very much like to mother a prince. Prince Humping Bear's father was autistic, but it was just ever so slightly that he had never been checked for it, and therefore nobody actually knew. When the Queen of the Whores went into labor, he was in the middle of shaving his head and was so surprised that he ran straight to the birthing tent. Inside, he was disgusted and yet vaguely interested to be watching the process of birth. When the prince finally crowned, he threw back the flap on the tent, and in a misguided attempt to honor his 1/16th American Indian heritage, he named the child the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes. That's how Prince Humping Bear got his name. When the prince was about 5 or 6 years old, his mother, who was now single again and nearing the end of her rope, decided that she would actually begin to prostitute herself after all, just to make ends meet. She couldn't stand to leave Humping Bear alone, though, so she dressed him up as a little girl and forced him to watch while she had sex for money. When the prince would cry or complain, his mother would assure him it was all just a dream. Humping Bear didn't remember that time of his life very well, but he did remember that he had vowed never to sleep again. As an older teenager, Humping Bear would break into apartments of people whom he had decided were of ill moral fiber. Nobody knows how the prince would decide this, but when he would hide naked in their bathtubs, wearing nothing but an old leather fencing mask and a friendship bracelet he had gotten from his first crush in middle school. She had rejected him, but in Humping Bear's experience, that just meant the girl wanted to fool around with him instead of going steady, which was all right by him. Wielding a 7-pound wrench, usually reserved for building aircraft engines, the prince would jump out at the owner of the apartment, who was usually making nature's call, and scream at them, "You're the one who killed my mother," even though his mother was still very much alive. Thusly, he would run, butt naked, to his car. One day, he decided he needed a different hobby to help pass the time and wanted to start a band. That's when he realized he had never made any real friends in his life. He tried to play every instrument by himself, but it grew tiresome quickly, as he had never had any formal training and did not have the patience to teach himself. In between horribly vivid flashbacks of his youth and jumping out of ne'er-do-wells bathtubs to dole out the harshness, he gave up and headed to his room. He sat and thought about his life for 3 days, in the very same corner where his mother had taught him how to undress a lady wearing overalls with his mouth. But on the 4th day, a beautiful woman appeared before him in his mind. She was his idea of the perfect lady, and she looked up at him from the inside of an elevator. What Humping Bear didn't know, however, was that this was not just in his imagination. His dream girl really was staring at him sitting there, in her imagination. And she smiled. She thought the prince was cute. Then the visions went away, and they never imagined each other again. Prince Humping Bear, having wallowed in his self-pity for what he felt was long enough, trekked into the forest, determined to live on his own for good. That moonless night, at just past 1 a.m., in a cave the prince had chosen to rest in, he was startled by an angry moose, and fought it with his bare hands, and won. Trust me, that's what happened. Being that he never went to a proper school or had any proper education, the thought of being an architect had never even crossed Prince Humping Bear's mind, even though he was actually God-gifted to be one of the best. One of his great ancestors was actually a world-famous Russian mathematician and architect who helped develop many of the formulas we use to measure the load-bearing capabilities of roofs and walls. As it was, Humping Bear was just content piling trees on top of each other and building himself basic shelters in the woods. He just felt good being able to construct something, even though he never understood exactly why. Then he died. He had decided a long time ago that he would take his life one day, and even wrote many suicide notes about it. He kept them all on a shelf, and none of them were ever read. After the prince moved out of his house, his mother pawned off his entire room, and the journals were lost forever. His only regret was that he never got to play ice hockey. It had always been the sport that looked most interesting to him. He'd always wanted to play on the Hartford Whalers. His dying words, which he spoke to himself, were, "Come on, I know you don't want to live forever." But his dying thought was, "Well, what if I do?"